Ooh. Okay. There's a guy having a snack in the window diagonal to mine. Whew. My social anxiety cannot handle this. Hello, ladies, gentlemen, non-binaries, dogs, if you're out there, raise a paw, please. I am Moldy. I usually end up on the internet once in a while talking about whatever the heck I read or I wrote or something along those lines. And if not, then I'm probably doing something like a vlog, although I try to avoid those, not gonna lie to you. I basically just film myself in not necessarily the best lighting with a fluffy microphone, yapping with a very neutral face about, well, books, usually. And there's that. So now that I've introduced myself, and you can decide whether or not you like my vibe, this video is a video that I've had planned, or at least I've had the idea for a little while, but I didn't really finish one of the books that I is part of this video for quite a while. It took some time. So this video is basically a video comparing / looking individually and together at two books written quite a bit of time apart. One of them is a response to the other, and those two books are The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, and then, let me hold up, I'm not going away, I promise, okay? I have The Empusium by Olga
Tokarczuk.
Insert, because I don't want to mess it up and sound stupid, because damage control. Right? So, fun fact, a little bit on the reading process. I read The Empusium, I think, last spring. And then The Magic Mountain started this winter. Last winter, technically. Right? But the first book, the older one, is The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. And then The Empusium was built as a modern response to, well, I'm going to give you a slight spoiler, but the misogynistic air that is present in the very time-appropriate Magic Mountain. And yeah, I thought that the best way to look at things would be to look at the similarities between the two books, at the differences between the two books, some thoughts about them together, but also individual of each other, how the reading experience was in itself, and I actually thought it would be kind of interesting to also look at the end maybe a bit at what I think the ideal reader for both would be, so you can pick and choose which one you like. And yeah, hope you enjoy that. Stick around if you want to. If not, totally get you. I'm not mad. So, for a little bit of context now about each one of the books. The Magic Mountain was written at the beginning of the 20th century, right? So, basically, it was intended by Thomas Mann to be this short, quick satire book that he started writing in 1912 after visiting his wife in a sanatorium. However, the First World War broke out, and that completely changed the focus of the book, basically, and it ended up being this decade-long process until he actually published it in 1924 that kind of acts in a way as a time capsule to look at all the stagnant and toxic ideas of pre-war Europe that basically paved the way to the war in itself. And there's kind of that. The Empusium, on the other hand, is actually published in 2022, was published in 2022, right after the author received her first Nobel Prize. And in itself, it is directly a response to The Magic Mountain, and I guess spoiler a little bit, though not really, on some of the observations that many people have made and I agree with, that The Magic Mountain has these misogynistic undertones that are not really undertones throughout the entirety of the book. And basically, The Empusium is just the feminist, genre bending response to that through ridicule in a way. Now, the story in itself is set slightly before the war, so it's not quite this. It changes a little bit the time and the actual genre of the book, where Man basically creates a coming of age story that is 700 pages and more long. Olga creates a 300 and something page, technically thriller horror story that is very much soaked in this Eastern European folklore. And the vibes are quite different, but the storylines and, there's things that overlap. And obviously I'll get into that. But I think a really fun fact is, for the Empusium, that a lot of the quotes that are said by the men in discussions in this, as I said, satirical way of looking at women. So she makes these misogynistic comments in her own book, right? So she's ridiculing it. Sorry for explaining it like a 2-year-old. She actually uses quotes from big figures in philosophy. Take, for example, Nietzsche. If I'm not mistaken, even Sartre. There's a whole bunch of them, but she actually quotes them directly. So a lot of the things that you find said in the book are actually good old-fashioned quotes from back in the day, from the big guns of philosophy. On a purely reading experience perspective, without actually getting into any of the contents of the book, I'll try to keep it as short as possible. Again, I read The Magic Mountain, which is over 700 pages more recently. It kind of felt like reading a school assignment, like you're enclosed in that book for such a long time. But it did end up being something that I liked and I enjoyed reading. It's just that at times I wanted to detach from it and take a little bit of a breather, but I wanted to finish it. However, really beautiful, great writing, very engaging. The dialogue is pretty freaking good. And the details are just beautiful. And it manages to create this cold, almost encasing, completely timeless haunting sphere, but not haunting in the same way that the Empusium does it. The Empusium was, at least up until the last 50 pages, the pacing was pretty similar, where you don't really feel like much happens, and at the same time you're still there for the entirety of the vibe. But obviously with it being 300 pages, it's so much more mystical, it's so much more mysterious, many more things and details are left unsaid, so it feels a tiny bit more surreal. And in the last 50 pages, it really just completely changes around the whole thing. And I feel like that's a very big turning point for a lot of people, and where they start to love it all the more. And somehow, although I don't know if this is an unfair edge, it kind of really created this love relationship for me. Although I understand that the first pages up until not the first pages, up until the last 50 pages, it's not that crazy of a deal. Arguably, that kind of also happens in its different, slightly more engaging way in the Magic Mountain, but it's just more of a vibe and writing style preference situation over here. So there's my gist on it. I did enjoy one a little bit more than the other, but just know that I really, really, really enjoyed both. So let's get a little bit into the similarities between the two books. Obviously, they both happen, as I said, in the same sort of time bubble that is before the war. However, the Empusium chooses a more specific time frame, and that is the year 1913. And then the Magic Mountain looks at more years, as it kind of approaches the war. And okay, I can't help but kind of note a little bit of the difference on this one, where it's like the focus is a little bit more political with the Magic Mountain, and it kind of has that vibe. And then the Empusium is solely focused on these discussions that happen. So, however, there is this fragile, almost twilight feeling to both of them when it comes to the timing, and it feels very oblivious of, actual time passing for the both books. Now, introducing you to the protagonists. Both of the protagonists in both of the books kind of have this blank slate profile, if that makes any sense, because they're both young, naive, they're both engineers. It's just that in the Magic Mountain you have Hans Castorp, and then in the Empusium you have Voynich, and those are basically the big things. They both come to these sanatoriums that are set in much the same place, not quite in a geographical sense, but in the same space, which I'll get into. And they both come over there for a short period of time and end up staying a much longer period of time. They're both technical and analytical. However, they both somehow end up becoming these absorbents of the ideologies and thoughts of these older men that surround their sphere of existence for the time spent in the sanatorium. As I said, the setting is much the same. However, the Empusium looks specifically to the first tuberculosis sanatorium that ever existed, that is actually in Poland, and that inspired the one that Thomas Mann is actually referencing in his. So that is kind of the difference. But in itself, they are both set somewhere up on a mountain, isolated from the flatlands, from, the village and the towns. And it kind of creates, again, this isolated, very desolate space that the people are living in. It kind of creates this almost alienation for the characters, but also for the reader, having that setting in mind. The discussions that the characters assist and take part in are, again, much on the same topics. So very much politics, religion, nature, human nature, gender, all of that stuff. The older men are always drinking in both books, and they're always overconfident and very charismatic, and somehow rub that information in the eyes of the young protagonists, and they somehow get swept away in the entirety of the chaos and abstractness of all of the discussions that happen, that feel very much like, wow, these guys are unemployed. I cannot put it in a more Gen Z way, but the entirety of the books, you're just thinking, wow, it must be nice to have all of that free time, So on that part, they definitely overlap, and for a reason. Both books end up having this central metaphor of illness as an actual sickness of society and the times, and again, political talk. So there's that, and in the midst of it all is this shared sort of warping of time, because of the way that things are described, because of the ritualization of everything that happens while the characters are actually in the sanatorium. Everything is very much ritualistic by that point. Long meals, absolutely insidious length talks, okay? Just resting in wrapped blankets and talking bullshit. It completely feels like it is devoid of time, and you're rotting with the characters and their bodies and society and everything. So that is sort of the central common metaphor and feeling that is very much imbued. Is that the word I'm looking for in both of the books? Imbued? Is that a word? I'm struggling. I'll search it up. I have to. Ooh, crunchy. Another shared aspect is this coverage on the medical realm. You see so many x-rays, and you have these inserts where it's just descriptions of the human body in these fluorescent ways on an x-ray, and it just really puts into perspective the fragility of the human being and the battle between the mind and the body, and how larger their life than life these characters and their ideals and the shit that is coming out of their mouth seems. And then how small and completely vulnerable a human being is in the end. Yeah. So, if you're into death and medical lingo and a very existential look at life, both of the books cater to that. Back onto the differences now. I will say probably the biggest difference, which is also said by, me saying that they're different genres, is the climax of the story, which mostly happens in the last chapters, pages. Because where the Magic Mountain goes into a very much massive, well-known historical event and quote-unquote explosion that shatters pretty much the entirety of the world, which is the First World War, the Empusium is much more pinpointed and localized with its effect, and it has this much more mythological, strictly related to the village and the forest around the sanatorium and in the place that the character is in. It's completely different in how things end and the feeling of it. It's much more, you have something very real versus something tremendously mystical, but that still has so many societal implications to it, especially when it comes to surprisingly gender, and that is expressed in mythology. As I said, the focus of the Empusium was to kind of add this feminist twist. So by the end, you see exactly how that comes into play in a complete turning around of the entirety of the book in a way. Because you find out this huge secret. But that happens in the last 50 pages, so, Another thing is the point of view from which the narration is presented, completely different. Where the Magic Mountain looks at things from the lens of Hans Castorp and his experiences and his mind and his experience of things, the Empusium has this eerie collective we that narrates, and I mean in quotes, we, that narrates the entirety of the story. So you'll find comments like, regarding, some shoes, some boots, we like this. It's little things like this that create this weird sense of mythical community of these beings that are being excluded out of the books, which are, in fact, women. This is not such a huge spoiler, I promise you. And with that also comes the fact that, how I said that both characters are built to be blank slates? Something turns around in the Empusium to where, yes, Voynich is sort of a blank slate, but in the last 50 pages you find out this completely hidden aspect of the character that you just did not expect to happen, that sort of strips away the blank slatedness, and especially in how the story is handled, it kind of adds this edge of identity by the end, but again, through these very eerie, folkloric tools that you just do not find in the Magic Mountain. Another huge difference, the pacing. Although the Empusium also has its moments of slowness, things pick up and they sometimes happen very suddenly, or you'll get changes that still feel very static because they're not that big. However, in the context of everything, it feels that way sometimes. At least to me it did. And especially with reading The Magic Mountain, the pacing is so intentionally slow and dragging, and it does so purely because it is meant to symbolize this completely unreal passage of time and the agonizing nature of it in a way. right? And then Tokarczuk, I think I said it right. I just said her name. Did I say it right? I don't know. We'll find out. Yeah, she picks up a lot faster. It's much sharper. There is a constant thrill and creepiness to the book that just stays there the entire time through. Another huge difference, as I mentioned, food and drinks are a big part of both of the books. They are described quite a bit, and you'll see it, and maybe you'll find that kind of weird. But the nature of the drinks is intentionally very different. Whereas in the Magic Mountain, you have these very intellectually fueling drinks like coffee and wine and all of that jazz, things that keep you awake, things that keep you lucid, things that are supposed to help. In the Empusium, you actually have a drink that is supposed to make you delirious. So there's that. It just adds to this completely under the influence quality of the Empusium. However, the characters do not know that they're consuming something that is actually making them act and think in a certain way. Another thing is the threat of both of the books and basically the ending are very, very diametrically different. Although shared, one of them adds this immense layer that eclipses the other, if that makes sense. So where you have the men threatening themselves and human beings in general threatening their own lives and creating their own demise in the Magic Mountain, in the Empusium, yes, you have that, but it is completely eclipsed in the end by the woods, by this supernatural power, this entity, this spirit that just is omnipresent and that, in a way, guides and warps the experience while still having something very similar. Because, don't get me wrong, the men do fuck up and they do destroy their own lives in their own ways. But that is not the focus. It is completely shifted into another discussion while still mentioning the other, if that makes any kind of sense. So by the end, you kind of have this theme of surrender versus subversion, in a way, to put it lightly without giving you any kind of spoilers. Before the light completely fails me by this point, let's get into the reader profiles. So, for the Magic Mountain, I think you should probably love some massive and challenging and chunky prose, okay? And preferably classics, because the way of writing in itself is pretty dry and classy and like elevated, and you feel the way of the character, but you also feel the way of the time through the character, right? You should also enjoy deep and slow-paced dives into politics, into history, into philosophy, and all of that jazz, because you just need the patience, because sometimes you will have debates go on for 40 pages. So there's that thing. Obviously, you'll have beautiful, detailed descriptions of spaces and things, and you'll go into medical details and all of that, but nonetheless, it is to be kept in mind when we're talking the Magic Mountain. Another thing, if you want a good, pretty exact cultural representation of the mindset pre-World War I feel like the Magic Mountain is quite good at that. It feels distant, but more realistic when put in the perspective of the Empusium. However, it still maintains that slightly magical quality, okay? That slight eeriness of timelessness. For the Empusium, I feel like if you enjoy sharp feminist literature that is basically making fun and completely roasting a male-dominated book and a very patriarchal lens on literature, then yeah, this is going to be for you. Another thing you might have to have a knack for is dark humor, a gothic atmosphere all throughout, where I feel like The Magic Mountain has more of a dark academia, if we are to go into aesthetics, vibe to it. And I think if you like Eastern European folklore, or in general, any kind of folklore, and you kind of have that thing for cryptids or, I don't know, creatures and magical things, you're definitely going to enjoy the Empusium a lot of times more. It's a plus, and I'm biased over there, not going to lie to you. I don't know what that says about me. And also, if you enjoy a faster and more suspenseful, more creepy, more unsettling vibe to the book, then the Empusium will 1000% be the choice for you. And a final piece of advice, if you're looking into reading both, or I have no idea, I'm just going to tell you one thing where I feel like I kind of failed, and I'm going to be terribly honest with you. You should read The Magic Mountain first and then The Empusium, because I read The Empusium first, then The Magic Mountain, and I wanted to do the video after I finished, but I reread The Empusium right now quite quickly because there's so much to capture in The Magic Mountain that you kind of forget what happens in here. Or, I mean, you get the gist of it, but you can't really properly feel like you're analyzing it. So I definitely recommend going into the hefty book first, completely absorbing everything in that. Things that you like, things that you don't like, don't get me wrong, ideas, whatever. It's still a good book for what it's worth. And then completely demolishing that, in a sense, while still being in the same space in the Empusium. And that is my 2 cents. I hope you enjoyed. I hope this was somewhat helpful in making you choose between the two, or maybe it sparked some interest to actually look into these books. They really are great, and I have to thank the people in the book club for suggesting that we read The Magic Mountain, because thank you all. And thank you for holding me accountable, because I just know that I would not have finished it even as slow as I did if it weren't for the book club, probably. So there's that. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you did not fall asleep. I hope I made some sense. I hope you're okay, and I hope the lighting is not too bad. Kisses, and I hope you're doing well whenever you're watching this video. And happy Easter, because I would like to edit before that, so Orthodox Easter. Yeah, that's just where I'm at. Yeah. Thanks for watching. Kisses. Bye.